Okay, so we'd like dive deep into paraconsistent logic.
All right,
It's
let's do it.
it's a fascinating topic, and I think one that like really connects with everyone.
Yeah,
All those times when you feel like the world is throwing contradictions at you.
yeah.
Well, it turns out there's a whole system of logic that's designed to deal with like those really head-scratching moments.
That's right. Paraconsistent logic, it doesn't shy away from inconsistencies.
Okay.
It's a way of reasoning that doesn't fall apart when things seem to clash.
So it's like that friend who can handle like a really heated debate without getting all flustered.
Exactly. It acknowledges that contradictions can exist without making the whole system crumble.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so to guide us on this deep dive, we've got an excerpt from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Great source.
Yeah, and it mentions something called explosion in logic.
Uh-oh.
It sounds kind of dramatic.
It is, in a way. In traditional logic, if you have a contradiction, you can conclude anything.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
So if I say the sky is blue and the sky is not blue, I can then conclude that elephants can fly.
Precisely. This principle is called X-contradiction quodlibet,
Catchy.
or ECQ. It's the idea that a contradiction makes the entire system trivial. You can derive any statement, whether it's true or false.
That seems a little absurd, doesn't it? How can like one contradiction lead to any random conclusion?
It's a bit like a chain reaction. If one link breaks, the whole chain falls apart. In traditional logic, a contradiction is like that broken link. It breaks the chain of reasoning and anything goes.
Oh, so it's like the whole system just kind of implodes?
Right.
Okay, so then how does paraconsistent logic avoid this explosion? It seems like contradictions would be pretty dangerous if they could lead to just anything.
Paraconsistent logic steps in and says, hold on, not so fast.
I like it.
It challenges the assumption that any inconsistency automatically renders a system useless. It provides a way to reason even in the presence of contradictions without everything going haywire.
Okay, so it's not about saying that contradictions are good. It's more about finding a way to like work with them.
Precisely. It recognizes that the world is often messy and complex. We might have incomplete information, different sources might contradict each other, or there might be genuine disagreements. Paraconsistency gives us tools to navigate this complexity.
I feel like we could all use some of those tools these days.
For sure.
So the article also mentions this distinction between paraconsistency and dialetheism.
Ah, yes.
Can you break that down for us?
Of course, paraconsistency is a feature of a logical system. It means the system doesn't explode when faced with contradictions. Dialetheism, on the other hand, is a philosophical belief that some contradictions are actually true.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So you could have a paraconsistent logic without being a diatheist.
exactly.
You might just want a system that can handle contradictions gracefully, even if you don't believe those contradictions are actually true.
Exactly. Paraconsistency is a broader concept. It's a tool that can be used by people with different philosophical views about truth and contradiction.
It clears things up. So it seems like this idea of explosion being like a valid principle is a relatively recent development in the history of logic.
Right.
The article mentions some pretty intriguing historical examples of thinkers who didn't quite buy into this whole contradiction equals everything is true idea.
Yeah, the history of logic is full of diverse perspectives.
Okay,
Take Aristotle, for example. He proposed something called the connective principle,
okay.
which essentially states that something can't be caused by both something existing and not existing.
Okay, so that seems pretty intuitive, like you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Precisely. And though mainly applied to conditional statements,
Uh-huh.
this principle implicitly rejects the idea that a contradiction can lead to just any arbitrary conclusion.
Okay, so you couldn't just jump from a contradiction to any random statement.
Right.
There had to be like some kind of connection.
Exactly.
Okay, so fast forward to the Middle Ages,
All right.
and we see these intense debates about the nature of logical consequences.
Yeah.
Like thinkers like Boethius and Abelard were grappling with this idea of containment,
Containment.
where the conclusion of an argument must somehow be contained within the meaning of the premises.
Right.
So the conclusion couldn't just be like any random statement.
Right.
It had to be connected to what you were starting with.
Exactly.
And so this notion of containment,
Yeah.
much like Aristotle's connective principle,
Right.
doesn't allow for a logic where contradictions lead to accepting everything is true.
Right.
But didn't everyone agree with like these medieval thinkers?
Well, not quite.
The article mentions these Parvipontanians who had a different take on things.
Ah, yes, the Parvipontanians, followers of a 12th century logician named Adam of Bolsham, they challenged this containment view. They emphasized truth preservation as the key feature of logical consequence, meaning that if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true.
Okay, but wouldn't that lead us right back to explosion?
Hmm.
Like, if a contradiction is true, then any conclusion would also have to be true to preserve truth.
You're absolutely right. And the Parvipontanians actually embraced this consequence. One of their members, William of Fouassans, even came up with an early version of what we now know as the C.I. Lewis argument for ECQ.
Wow, so the seeds of this whole explosion idea were sown way back then.
They were.
But weren't there alternative perspectives from other parts of the world?
Absolutely. Asian philosophical traditions, particularly Jaina and Buddhist logic, were much more open to the possibility of statements being both true and false. Buddhist logicians developed systems that relied on a pervasion relation between premises and conclusion, similar to the containment idea.
So even centuries ago, there wasn't just like one universally accepted way of dealing with contradictions in logic.
Not at all. This diversity of thought is crucial to understanding the development of paraconsistent logic in the 20th century.
Okay, so let's talk about those 20th century developments.
All right.
The article mentions some key figures who independently developed paraconsistent logics.
Yeah.
It's like this idea was popping up all over the place.
It really was. You have Stanisław Jaskowski in Poland, who built on the work of his teacher Sukasiewicz, who himself had criticized Aristotle's law of non-contradiction.
So even those who defended traditional logic were planting seeds of doubt.
In a way.
Interesting. What about other pioneers?
Around the same time, you have Søren Halden in Sweden exploring the logic of nonsense. And then Florencio Senjo and Newton Acosta in South America focusing on mathematical applications of paraconsistent logic.
And of course, we can't forget about the development of relevant logics, right?
Absolutely. Relevant logics championed by thinkers like Alan Ross Anderson and Newell Belknap in the U.S. really emphasize the importance of a connection between premises and conclusion. They argued that a conclusion must be relevant to the premises, sharing some common meaning or content.
Okay, so instead of focusing on whether a contradiction makes everything true,
Yeah.
relevant logics zero in on whether the conclusion actually has anything to do with the premises.
Exactly. And this focus on relevance naturally leads to a rejection of ECQ. You can't just jump from a contradiction to any random conclusion, especially if that conclusion has no meaningful connection to what you started with.
That makes sense. So it seems like paraconsistent logic has a lot of different flavors and approaches.
It does.
It's not just one monolithic thing, is it?
Not at all. The beauty of paraconsistent logic lies in its diversity. It's a family of logics, each with its own unique features and motivation.
And this brings us to the part where it gets really relevant to you, the listener. Why should you care about paraconsistent logic? It's fascinating stuff, but how does it connect to the real world?
That's a great question, and the answer is, in more ways than you might think, paraconsistent logic isn't just an abstract theoretical exercise. It has practical and thought-provoking implications for how we understand knowledge, reason, and even make decisions in everyday life.
Ooh, give us some examples.
Well, for starters, consider the history of science. Think back to Bohr's theory of the atom, which we mentioned earlier. It was actually inconsistent with parts of it contradicting well-established principles of physics.
Wait, so a theory that contradicted itself was actually useful?
Exactly. Bohr's theory, despite its inconsistencies, was a major breakthrough in our understanding of atomic structure. It led to significant progress in physics, even though it wasn't perfectly consistent.
Mind blown. So paraconsistent logic helps us see that even inconsistent theories can be valuable and lead to new insights.
Precisely. It highlights the fact that inconsistency doesn't always equal worthlessness. Sometimes embracing a bit of contradiction can be a catalyst for scientific advancement.
That's a powerful idea. It makes you rethink the whole consistency at all costs approach, doesn't it?
It does, and this applies not just to science, but to other areas of knowledge as well.
Okay, you've piqued my curiosity. What other areas can benefit from a paraconsistent perspective?
Let's delve into some more intriguing examples. How about paradoxes, those mind-bending statements that seem to contradict themselves, but still make you think paraconsistent logic offers a way to reason about these paradoxes without falling into absurdity?
Oh, I love a good paradox. Can you give us an example? What about the classic liar paradox?
Perfect example. The liar paradox, this sentence is not true, leads to a contradiction. If it's true, then it's false, and if it's false, then it's true. Traditional logic struggles with this, but paraconsistent logic provides tools to analyze such paradoxes without the whole system collapsing.
So instead of just saying, oh, that's a paradox, we can't talk about it,
Right.
paraconsistent logic lets us engage with these tricky ideas.
Exactly. It allows us to explore the structure of these paradoxes and perhaps even glean insights from them.
Okay, that's pretty cool. But how about something a bit closer to home? Does paraconsistent logic have any relevance to, like, our everyday lives?
Absolutely. Think about how often you encounter conflicting information in the real world. News reports might contradict each other, experts might disagree, and even your own beliefs might sometimes clash.
Tell me about it. Information overload is a real struggle these days. It feels like everyone has a different story.
Exactly. And this is where paraconsistent logic can be incredibly helpful. It provides a framework for reasoning about inconsistencies without getting overwhelmed. It helps us make sense of conflicting data, evaluate different perspectives, and even revise our own beliefs in a rational way.
So instead of freaking out when we encounter conflicting information,
Yeah.
paraconsistent logic gives us a way to, like, stay calm and think things through carefully.
Precisely. It encourages us to approach contradictions with a critical eye, considering the sources, evaluating the evidence, and making informed judgments even when things aren't perfectly clear-cut.
Wow. I'm starting to see how powerful this way of thinking can be. It's like a mental toolkit for navigating the complexities of the world.
Exactly, and this toolkit has implications for a wide range of fields, from artificial intelligence to linguistics to even the foundations of mathematics.
Whoa, hold on. Paraconsistent logic is shaking up math. Now you've really got my attention.
It's true. Even in math, which is often seen as the realm of absolute certainty and consistency, there have been attempts to use paraconsistent logic to explore alternative foundations of set theory and arithmetic.
But wait, isn't math supposed to be completely consistent?
Right.
Like 2 plus 2 always equals 4, right?
That's the traditional view. But some mathematicians and logicians have argued that even math might benefit from a paraconsistent perspective. They point out that certain fundamental concepts, like infinity and sets, have led to paradoxes and inconsistencies in the past.
Oh, right. I vaguely remember learning about Russell's paradox in college. Something about sets that contain themselves or don't contain themselves. It made my head spin.
Exactly. Paraconsistent logic offers a way to address these inconsistencies without abandoning the core principles of set theory. It allows mathematicians to explore new and potentially more intuitive ways of understanding these fundamental concepts.
This is blowing my mind. Math science paradoxes, everyday reasoning. It seems like paraconsistent logic is popping up everywhere.
It's true. Paraconsistent logic is a versatile tool with applications in a wide range of fields. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about consistency, contradiction, and the nature of truth itself.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've gone from the basic definition of paraconsistent logic to its historical roots,
Yeah,
its philosophical underpinnings, and even its practical applications.
right.
But let's get down to brass tacks.
Okay.
How does this stuff actually work?
All right.
What are some of the techniques used in paraconsistent logic to handle contradictions without everything going haywire?
Excellent question. Let's dive into some of the specific tools and techniques used in paraconsistent logic. It's a fascinating world of innovative approaches to reasoning.
Lead the way. I'm ready to explore these paraconsistent toolkits.
Let's go. One intriguing approach is called discussive logic, developed by the Polish logician Stanisław Jaśkowski. Imagine a lively discussion where people have different opinions, maybe even contradictory beliefs.
Oh, like a family dinner conversation about politics.
Exactly. Jaśkowski wanted to formalize this kind of discourse where different perspectives can coexist without causing a logical meltdown.
Okay, but how do you actually, translate a messy dinner conversation into a formal logic? Seems like a big jump.
That's where modal logic comes in. Modal logic deals with concepts like possibility and necessity.
Okay.
In discussive logic, each person's beliefs are treated as possible worlds.
So it's like saying, in this person's world, this is true, but in another person's world, something else might be true.
Precisely. And the logic allows us to consider both statements without leading to an explosion. A statement is considered true in the discourse if it's true in at least one of these possible worlds.
So even if two people completely contradict each other, the logic doesn't fall apart because they're essentially operating in different logical universes?
Exactly. It's a way of acknowledging the diversity of perspectives without letting those differences derail the entire conversation. And speaking of managing information carefully,
Okay.
another technique is called non-adjunctive systems.
Non-adjunctive systems. What's that about?
Well, adjunction is the rule that lets you combine two separate statements into a conjunction, basically saying both are true.
Like if I say, it's raining, I have an umbrella, I can combine those into, it's raining and I have an umbrella.
Exactly. But in non-adjunctive systems, this rule is restricted. You can't just combine any two statements willy-nilly.
Why not? What's the problem with conjunctions?
If you have combining contradictory statements into a conjunction could lead to that explosion we talked about.
Ah, I see. So these non-adjunctive systems are saying, we can talk about this statement separately, but let's not smash them together if it's going to cause problems.
Precisely. It's a way of carefully managing information to avoid those explosive situations.
I'm starting to see a theme here. It's like walking a tightrope between acknowledging inconsistencies and preventing them from blowing everything up.
Right. This need to carefully manage information leads to another approach called preservationism.
Preservationism, what's being preserved?
Consistency. The idea behind preservationism is to divide a set of statements into consistent chunks or fragments.
So if you have a bunch of statements, some of which contradict each other, you sort them into separate piles where everything in each pile agrees.
Exactly. Then you can reason within each consistent chunk without worrying about inconsistencies in the other chunks.
Like creating little pockets of consistency within a larger, potentially inconsistent system.
Precisely. This allows you to draw inferences and work with the information without everything collapsing due to contradictions.
This is starting to sound like a logician's version of tidying up, organizing information into neat compartments. But what if you need to use information from different chunks?
That's a great question, and that's where the idea of permeability comes in. Some preservationist systems allow for a limited flow of information between consistent chunks.
So it's like those drawer dividers where you can adjust the compartments if you need to.
Exactly. You can carefully control what information is allowed to pass between chunks, ensuring that only relevant and consistent information is shared.
This is fascinating. It's like a delicate dance trying to find the right balance between keeping things consistent and allowing for the necessary flow of information.
It is. And this idea of adapting to the specific context of the information leads us to adaptive logics.
Adaptive logics, how do they adapt?
Adaptive logics adjust their rules and inferences based on the situation. They start with a basic set of rules, a lower limit logic, but they can also incorporate additional rules like the disjunctive syllogism as long as no contradictions are encountered.
So they're cautiously optimistic, assuming things are consistent until proven otherwise.
Precisely. But if a contradiction pops up, the logic adapts and retracts any inferences that relied on that assumption of consistency.
Kind of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
You could say that adaptive logics are dynamic, constantly adjusting to the presence or absence of contradictions. They let you reason with potentially inconsistent information while minimizing the risk of those inconsistencies leading to absurd conclusions.
This is making me think about how we reason in our own lives. We often make assumptions and draw conclusions based on what we believe to be true, but then new information comes along and we might have to revise our beliefs or even completely change our minds.
Exactly. Adaptive logics can be seen as a formal model of this kind of belief revision. They capture the dynamic nature of human reasoning, where we're constantly adjusting to new evidence and potentially conflicting information.
I'm starting to see how these different techniques in paraconsistent logic aren't just abstract theories, but reflections of how we think and reason in the real world.
That's one of the most fascinating things about paraconsistent logic. It's not just about creating weird and wacky systems. It's about understanding the complexities of human thought and finding ways to represent that complexity formally and rigorously.
So we've covered discussive logic, non-adjunctive systems, preservationism, and adaptive logics. Any other tools in this paraconsistent toolbox?
We've got a few more tricks up our sleeve. Let's talk about the logics of formal inconsistency, or LFIs.
LFI sounds intense. What are they all about?
LFIs take a different approach by directly incorporating the concept of consistency into the logic itself. They have a special symbol that represents consistency, and they use this symbol to control how contradictions are handled.
So instead of just dancing around contradictions, LFIs confront them head on.
Exactly. LFIs aim to capture the idea that classical logic is fine in consistent contexts. But when a contradiction arises, we need a different set of rules.
Okay, but how does this work in practice? How do you actually use a symbol to represent consistency?
It's a bit like a flag that gets raised when a contradiction is present. The LFI rules then prevent that contradiction from spreading and causing the whole system to explode.
So it's like a safety valve that prevents the logical pressure from getting too high.
Precisely, LFIs allow you to pinpoint inconsistencies without letting them derail the entire reasoning process. You can isolate and analyze those contradictions without everything falling apart.
This is starting to sound like a superpower. Being able to handle contradictions without freaking out seems incredibly useful.
It is, and LFIs have been a major area of research in paraconsistent logic, especially in Brazil, where Newton da Costa pioneered this approach.
Okay, so we've added LFIs to our toolkit. What else is there? I'm feeling like a logician in training here.
Well, let's not forget about many-valued logics. They challenge the classic assumption that there are only two truth values, true and false.
Wait, so there could be more than just true or false. What other options are there?
That's the beauty of many-valued logics. They open up a whole world of possibilities. The simplest example is a three-valued logic, where you have true, false, and a third value that could be interpreted as both true and false, or neither true nor false.
Whoa, that's tricky. So a statement could be both true and false at the same time. Doesn't that completely break the rules?
It does challenge the classical rules, but that's the point. Many valued logics let us model situations where the classic binary framework of true and false just doesn't cut it.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. What kind of situations would need a third truth value?
Think about vague concepts like tall or bald is someone who's 5'10" tall. It depends. There's no clear-cut answer. A three-valued logic could represent this vagueness by assigning a truth value that's neither definitively true nor false.
Ah, so it's a way of capturing the gray areas, the uncertainties, the it depends aspects of life.
Precisely, many valued logics provide a more nuanced way of representing the complexities of the world. And some of these logics, like the paraconsistent logic LP, can handle contradictions without exploding.
Okay, this is blowing my mind, but in a good way. So instead of forcing everything into neat categories of true and false, We can use many-valued logics to represent the fuzziness and ambiguity that exist in reality.
Exactly. And this can be incredibly useful for modeling real-world situations where information is incomplete, vague, or even contradictory.
I'm starting to see how these different paraconsistent tools each have their own strengths and weaknesses depending on what you're trying to model or understand.
Precisely. There's no one-size-fits-all approach in paraconsistent logic. The choice of which logic to use depends on the specific problem at hand and the philosophical assumptions you're working with.
Okay, so we've added many valued logics to our arsenal. Are there any other tools we should know about?
There's one more family of logics that's crucial to understanding paraconsistency relevant logics.
Relevant logics, we touched on this earlier, but remind me again how they connect to the whole paraconsistency thing.
Right. So relevant logics, as the name suggests, focus on making sure that the conclusion of an argument is relevant to the premises. They challenge the idea that you can infer just anything from a contradiction.
Right, because if you accept a contradiction, traditional logic says you can conclude that elephants can fly, even though that has nothing to do with the original contradiction.
Exactly. Relevant logics aim to avoid these irrelevant inferences by demanding a meaningful connection between the premises and the conclusion.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do they actually, enforce this relevance? How do they make sure the connections are genuine?
They modify the rules of inference, particularly those governing implications. They introduce stricter conditions for when an implication is considered valid.
So they're essentially putting their foot down, saying you can't just jump from statement A to statement B just because there's a contradiction somewhere else. There needs to be a real logical connection.
Precisely. Relevant logics tighten up the rules to ensure conclusions are genuinely supported by the premises.
This makes me think about how we often hear arguments where the conclusion seems to come out of left field. Like someone might say, you disagree with me about climate change, therefore you must hate puppies.
That's a classic example of an irrelevant conclusion. Relevant logics give us a framework for analyzing arguments and spotting those fallacious leaps in reasoning. They help us stay focused on the real connections between ideas.
This is starting to feel like a superpower for critical thinking, like a built-in BS detector for bad arguments.
You could say that relevant logics help us cut through the noise and zero in on arguments that have a genuine logical connection.
Wow, this deep dive has been incredible. We've gone from the basic definition of paraconsistent logic all the way to these really specific techniques for handling contradictions. And what's amazing is that it's not just theoretical. It connects to how we think and reason in the real world.
I'm glad you're seeing those connections. And what we've explored is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to discover in the world of paraconsistent logic.
So we got this whole toolkit of paraconsistent logics, from discussive logic to LFIs to many valued and relevant logics. It really is like a whole new way of looking at the world and how we reason. But for you, the listener, what's the takeaway? Why should you care about paraconsistent logic?
That's the key question. Paraconsistent logic isn't just an abstract game for logicians. It challenges us to rethink some fundamental assumptions about knowledge and reasoning.
Okay, I'm ready for the big so what moment. How does paraconsistency actually change the game?
It challenges us to reconsider the role of consistency in our thinking. We're often taught that consistency is the ultimate goal, the hallmark of rationality. But paraconsistent logic shows us that maybe, just maybe, there's more to the story.
You mean being consistent isn't always the most important thing? That's a pretty radical idea.
It is, and it's not about throwing consistency out the window completely. It's about recognizing that sometimes embracing a bit of contradiction can actually lead to a deeper, richer understanding.
Can you give us an example? When might a contradiction actually be a good thing?
Think about creativity. Artists, writers, musicians, they often have to embrace contradictions and tensions in their work to create something new and interesting.
So it's like that saying, there's no light without darkness. You need those contrasting elements, those opposing forces, to create something truly meaningful.
Exactly, and this applies not just to art, but to other areas of life as well. Think about ethical dilemmas where there might be conflicting values or principles at play.
Right, like those thought experiments where you have to choose between saving one person or 5 people. There's no easy answer that's perfectly consistent with every moral principle.
Precisely, paraconsistent logic encourages us to engage with these messy, complex situations. It helps us acknowledge the inconsistencies and tensions and work through them without needing simplistic black and white solutions.
This is making me realize how much we try to force Soul into these neat little boxes. But reality is full of nuance and contradictions.
Exactly, and paraconsistent logic gives us a way to embrace that complexity. We can start to see contradictions not as failures, but as potential sources of insight and growth.
So it's not about saying that contradictions are always true. It's more about saying they're inevitable and sometimes even valuable.
Right. It's a shift in perspective from fearing contradictions to being curious about what they can reveal.
This even makes me think differently about how we handle disagreements with others. We often just try to win arguments and prove the other person wrong. but maybe there's a better way.
I think you're onto something. Paraconsistent logic suggests that there might be value in exploring those disagreements, acknowledging different perspectives, and seeing if those contradictions can lead to a more complete understanding.
So instead of shutting down when we encounter different opinions, we can use those moments of disagreement as starting points for dialogue and exploration.
Exactly. It's about seeing those disagreements not as threats, but as opportunities to learn and grow.
This has been a truly mind-expanding deep dive. I feel like I've gained a whole new set of mental tools, tools for navigating a complex world, for reasoning through tough issues, and even for approaching disagreements with more curiosity and open-mindedness.
I'm so glad to hear that paraconsistent logic has a way of challenging our assumptions and opening up new ways of seeing things.
It really makes you wonder, could there be times when embracing a little bit of contradiction actually leads to a better understanding? It's definitely something to think about.